Why does everything feel heavy, even the things you once loved? You tell yourself it's laziness, but deep down, something feels off. Because this isn't about motivation, it's about exhaustion you can't see. And in this story, we'll slowly uncover what's really draining you. It doesn't start loudly. There's no clear moment where everything breaks. No single day you can point to and say, "That's when I became like this." It's quieter than that, more like a slow fading, like colors losing their brightness, little by little, until one day you realize everything feels muted. You wake up, not completely exhausted, but not rested either. Your body moves, but your mind feels somewhere else. And the strange part is, nothing is technically wrong. You're not sick. You're not in danger. Your life, from the outside, looks normal. But inside, even the smallest task feels heavier than it should. Replying to a message, starting something simple, making a decision, it all feels like it requires more energy than you have. So you delay it. You push it a little further, and then you start calling yourself lazy. Because what else could it be? You see other people moving forward, being productive, handling things that seem impossible for you right now. And you wonder, why can't I just do it? But what most people don't realize is, laziness isn't always about not wanting to act. Sometimes it's about not having the energy to care. And that kind of tiredness doesn't show up in your body first. It shows up in your thoughts. You stop feeling excited about things that once mattered. Not because you don't love them anymore, but because your mind is already full of unfinished thoughts, unprocessed emotions, quiet stress that never really leaves. It's like carrying a weight, not in your hands, but somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to explain. And the more you carry it, the harder it becomes to move. So you slow down, you hesitate, you avoid, not because you don't care, but because you're already overwhelmed, before you even begin. And then comes the guilt, that quiet voice that tells you you're wasting time, that you should be doing more, that you're falling behind, that you're not trying hard enough. So you push yourself even when you don't feel ready. You try to force motivation, but it doesn't come, because motivation doesn't grow well in a tired mind. It needs space. It needs clarity. It needs a moment of quiet, something you haven't really had in a long time. Instead, your mind keeps running, thinking about what you should have done, what you still need to do, what might go wrong next. It never really stops. Even when you're resting, you're not resting, because your thoughts are still working. And slowly, that constant mental noise starts to drain you in ways you don't immediately notice. You begin to feel disconnected from your goals, from your energy, even from yourself. Things that once felt simple now feel complicated, and things that once felt exciting now feel like pressure. So instead of moving forward, you pause, not intentionally, but because something inside you just can't keep up anymore. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. Because from the outside, it looks like you're doing nothing, but inside, you're doing too much. Too much thinking, too much worrying, too much carrying without ever putting it down. And no one really teaches you how to rest your mind. We're taught how to keep going, how to push through, how to stay productive, but not how to pause, without feeling guilty about it. So you end up stuck in this quiet cycle, feeling tired, doing less, judging yourself for it, then feeling even more tired. And the cycle continues, not because you're weak, but because you're human. Because your mind was never meant to run non-stop, without a moment to breathe. And maybe what you've been calling laziness is actually your mind asking for something it hasn't received in a long time. Not more pressure, but more space. Not more discipline, but more understanding. And once you begin to see it this way, something shifts, just slightly, but enough to make you question what's really going on beneath the surface. Because this isn't just about being tired. It's about something deeper, something quieter, something most people never talk about. And in the next part, we'll gently uncover the hidden struggle behind this feeling, the part of you that's been carrying more than it shows. If this content speaks the words you can't explain, click subscribe. Thank you for your support. The truth is, you didn't start explaining yourself for no reason. It came from somewhere, maybe from a time when being misunderstood felt dangerous, not physically, but emotionally, when silence led to assumptions and assumptions led to distance. So you learned early on that clarity equals safety. If you explain well enough, people won't leave, people won't judge, people won't get the wrong idea. And for a while, that worked. You became someone who could smooth things over, someone who could resolve tension, someone who could translate feelings into words. You were easy to understand, and people liked that. But what they didn't see was how much effort it took, how every explanation required you to step outside yourself and think. How will they interpret this? How should I say this so it doesn't get misunderstood? How do I make this easier for them, even if it's harder for me? Slowly, without realizing it, you stopped speaking from truth and started speaking from strategy. Not lying, just adjusting, softening your words, rearranging your feelings, choosing expressions that would be accepted. And over time, you got good at it. So good that people assumed you were naturally calm, naturally clear, naturally easy, but they didn't see the internal calculation behind every sentence. And that's where the real problem begins, because when you constantly explain yourself, you start believing that your raw, unfiltered self isn't enough, that it needs editing, context, clarification. You begin to feel like you're not understood, it must be your fault. So you try harder, you explain more, you go deeper, you repeat yourself, hoping that eventually something will click. But sometimes it doesn't, and when it doesn't, it's more good. Because it doesn't feel like a simple misunderstanding. It feels like rejection, like you gave everything you could, and it still wasn't enough. And that feeling, it lingers. So the next time you try even harder until one day you realize something uncomfortable. No matter how clearly you explain, you can't control how someone chooses to understand you, and that realization, it shakes something inside you, because it challenges everything you've been relying on. All this time, you thought connection came from clarity, but now you're seeing that clarity doesn't guarantee understanding, and that's terrifying. Because if explaining doesn't ensure connection, then what does? And suddenly, you feel exposed, because explaining was your safety net. Without it, you don't know how people will see you. You don't know if they'll stay, if they'll judge, they'll misunderstand. And maybe that's why stopping feels so hard. Because it's not just about letting go of a habit, it's about letting go of control. Control over how you're perceived, control over interpreted, control over how you're accepted. And giving up that control feels like vulnerability, but not the kind people talk about, not the open up air kind. This is quieter. It's the vulnerability of being seen without explanation, of letting your words exist without defending them, of allowing misunderstanding, without rushing to fix it. And that kind of vulnerability, it's uncomfortable because it forces you to face something deeper. The fear that maybe, if people don't understand you, they won't value you. And that fear, it's not irrational. It comes from real experiences, moments when you weren't heard, times when your intentions were twisted, situations where silence created distance. So of course, you learned to explain. Of course, you tried to control the narrative. Of course, you wanted to be clear. But somewhere along the way, that survival strategy became a burden. Because now, you feel responsible for how others perceive you. And that's an impossible responsibility, because people don't just hear your words, they filter them through their own beliefs, their emotions, their own experiences, and no amount of it can override that completely. So you're left in a loop. Explain, misunderstood. Explain more. Feel drained. Eventually, break out of it. Not by solving it, but by stepping it, by choosing silence. But here's the part. Sometimes, that silence isn't just peace, it's also exhaustion. Sometimes, you're choosing not to explain, but you found clarity. Sometimes, you're choosing it because you don't have the energy anymore. And that's important to recognize, because there's a difference between peaceful silence and silent burnout. One comes from understanding, the other comes from giving up. And if you don't notice the difference, you might think you've healed, when you've actually just withdrawn. And that creates another kind of distance, not from others, but from yourself. Because deep down, you still want to be understood. You still want action. You still want someone to see you clearly. But now, you're afraid to try, afraid that explaining will drain you again, afraid that not explaining will isolate you, so you stay in between, half open, half closed, and that space, it feels confusing because you don't know if you're protecting yourself or just hiding. And that's the real struggle. Not explaining, but understanding why you needed to in the first place, and whether letting go of it means growth or just another form of defense. In the next part, we'll explore what it actually looks like to stop explaining yourself in a healthy way, not as avoidance, not as shutdown, but as something quieter, something stronger, something that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. Maybe the goal was never to stop explaining completely. Maybe it was to stop explaining unnecessarily. There's a difference. One is silence as a reaction, the other is silence as a choice. And learning that difference changes everything, because not every situation requires the same version of you. Moments where explaining is skillful, where clarity builds connection, where words bring people closer. But there are also moments where explaining becomes self-erasure, where you're not sharing, you're sensing. And the key isn't to choose one over the other, it's to know which one is needed. That awareness, it doesn't come instantly. It slowly through small moments, like when someone misunderstands you. And instead of rushing to correct them, you pause and ask yourself, is this a misunderstanding worth fixing, or just one I'm uncomfortable with? Because those two things aren't the same. Not every discomfort needs a response. Sometimes, the discomfort comes from letting go of control, and that's okay. Another shift is noticing who you're explaining yourself to. Not everyone deserves the same level of access. Some people listen. Some people assume. Some people interpret everything through their own lens. And when you recognize that, you stop treating every conversation the same. You become more intentional, not closed, selective. And that selectiveness, it's not arrogance. It's self-respect, because your energy, it's limited. Your words, they carry weight. And constantly explaining yourself to people who don't value that is like pouring water into something that can't hold it. So you start using differently. You explain awareness. You stay silent, where distance, not as a rule, but as a feeling, a quiet sense of, this is worth my energy, or this isn't. And the more you trust that feeling, the less you feel the need to justify yourself, because you're no longer explaining to be accepted or explaining to be understood by the right people. And that's a big shift, because it changes the purpose of your words. They're no longer a tool for approval. They become a reflection of your truth. And when your words come from that place, they feel different, simpler, clearer, lighter. You don't over-explain. You don't over-correct. You just say what feels true and let it exist. And yes, some people will misunderstand you. Some will walk away. Some will create their own version of you. But here's the quiet truth that was always happening anyway. The only difference now is that you're not exhausting your control it, and in that space, something unexpected happens. You start to feel more like yourself. The version of you that's constantly adjusting, version that just is. And that feeling, it's subtle, powerful, because it doesn't come from being understood by everyone, from not needing to be. And that doesn't mean caring. It means you stop chasing perfect clarity, perfect perception, perfect acceptance, and instead, you allow connection to happen naturally with people who are willing to meet you halfway, who don't need you to explain everything, who can sit in the silence and still feel close to you. Those are the connections that stay, not because you explained yourself perfectly, but because they chose to understand you, and that choice, it matters more than any explanation. So maybe this shift you're going through, this quiet decision to stop explaining yourself, isn't something to be afraid of. Maybe it's distance, maybe it's direction, a movement toward something more honest, more balanced, more real. And yes, it will feel uncomfortable at times. You'll question yourself. You'll wonder if you should say more. And sometimes you will, because growth isn't about being rigid. It's about being aware of when you're speaking from truth and when you're speaking from fear. And slowly, that awareness becomes your guide. Not rules, not strategies, just a quiet understanding of yourself. And from there, everything becomes simpler, not but clearer. You don't need to explain every silence. You don't need to justify every choice. You just live in a way that feels aligned and trust that the right people will understand enough. And if they don't, that's okay too. Because your life isn't meant to be perfectly explained. It's meant to be lived. So if the feeling has been sitting with you lately, this quiet urge to stop explaining yourself, maybe don't rush to label it. Don't assume it's distance. Don't assume it's coldness. Just observe it, stay with it, and see what it's trying to show you. Because sometimes the most important shifts in your life don't come from what you say, but from what you finally allow yourself. Not to say, and if this kind of quiet reflection speaks to you, there's more waiting for you. More thoughts you haven't fully explored yet, more patterns you're just beginning to notice. So stay a little longer, keep listening, and maybe in the next story, you'll understand yourself even deeper.